tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
The tariffs that were supposed to bring jobs back to the US dealt a serious blow to automakers. In 2025, when the whole world was expecting another boom in the American auto industry, Ford, one of the largest and most influential companies, announced that it was suspending operations at its key plants. Factories in Chicago and Michigan, where iconic models such as the Ford Explorer and Lincoln Aviator were assembled, suddenly fell silent. Workers were told to go home. No explanation, no deadlines, just silence. And the reason? Not the economic crisis, not supply chain disruptions, tariffs.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
President Donald Trump promised that a 25% tax on all imported cars and parts would help create jobs in America. But as it turned out, these measures hit not foreign companies but domestic manufacturers. The same parts that Ford and other companies order from abroad have become significantly more expensive, and US production has not been able to adapt to the new conditions. The result is closed factories, thousands of unemployed, and problems that, against the backdrop of loud declarations of America first, look like a real crisis.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
In reality, the situation was much worse than it seemed at first glance. The stakes were high. Ford lost $1 billion, and that was only in 2025. While the company was trying to adapt its products to the new conditions, General Motors and Stellantis began closing factories in Canada and Mexico. But that was only the first blow. This was followed by rising prices that exceeded the usual limits. Car manufacturers were forced to raise prices for their vehicles, including those produced in the US, but this did not help. Consumers began to switch to cheaper Chinese models, and exports of American cars to other countries became impossible due to rising tariffs.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
No one expected this to be a disaster for the entire industry. Manufacturers began cutting forecasts, laying off employees, closing factories, and revising plans. And what was the end result? The US economy suffered, jobs never returned, and the very idea of America first began to be questioned more and more. See how the introduction of tariffs, which promised to save American jobs, led to a real industrial disaster. This is not just another economic setback. It is a global crisis that has hit those who are trying to move the economy forward. And the question that cannot be ignored is, are the losses suffered by the American auto industry worth the sacrifice of tariffs?
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, you know, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
The introduction of 25% tariffs on all cars manufactured outside the US in 2025 has become one of the most controversial decisions in Donald Trump's trade policy. These measures were announced as a step towards bringing manufacturing back to American soil and creating new jobs for US citizens.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
However, what initially seemed like a powerful boost to the economy led to unexpected and catastrophic consequences for the American automotive industry itself. In one of the biggest shocks for automotive giant Ford Motor Company, the company was forced to suspend production at several of its plants in the US. The Chicago plant, where iconic models such as the Ford Explorer and Lincoln Aviator were assembled, suddenly fell silent. Michigan, where the Bronco and Ranger were manufactured, shut down and workers were told to go home with no indication of when they would return. All this happened against a backdrop of increased tariffs on imported auto parts and materials. What seemed like a step toward economic recovery turned out to be a severe blow to the very fabric of the American auto industry.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
These tariffs, which were supposed to target Chinese and Mexican companies, turned out to be a weapon that hurt American factories. Spare parts that were traditionally supplied from abroad rose in price by 25%. This meant that even companies such as Ford, which manufactured cars on their own soil, faced a sharp increase in production costs. Models intended for mass production, such as the Ford Explorer, were threatened because tariffs increased the price of every part. Even models that did not use components manufactured abroad could not escape price increases. For example, the Bronco and Ranger, manufactured in Michigan, whose components were mostly localized, still faced increases in the price of steel, electronics, and even packaging, which depended on foreign supplies.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
For Ford, this was the moment when the decision was made to close several large plants in the US, leading to a sharp reduction in jobs. Thousands of workers received notices that they needed to return home and wait for a call, to which no one knew the answer. This was the first sign that tariffs were not a tool that could lead to favorable economic growth, but rather created new economic problems within the country itself. Analysts following the developments expressed concern that the tariffs not only failed to increase the number of jobs, but also led to lower wages and job losses, especially in areas where automotive assembly plants were concentrated. While President Trump and his administration claimed that the tariffs would bring manufacturing back to America, in reality they only increased competition and led to unnecessary costs that put pressure on companies operating in the US. Ford's failures were the catalyst for the crisis in the US auto industry.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
Shortly after Ford decided to suspend production at its US plants, rumors and unofficial reports began to circulate online that the company was preparing for even more job cuts. Rumors that Ford might move some of its assembly operations to Mexico or Canada caused panic among workers who feared that their plants could be affected. However, despite these rumors, the real reason for the shutdown of production lines was not only high tariffs, but also a deeper structural crisis within the company itself. To offset the increase in the cost of imported parts, Ford began raising prices for its vehicles, including popular models such as the Mustang Mach-E Maverick and Bronco Sport, which were manufactured in Mexico. Supply chain problems and a sharp rise in production costs were only the beginning. Following Ford, other automakers were forced to raise prices, cut production, and revise their forecasts. Problems with a component importer ultimately led to the collapse of part of the supply chain, resulting in a general slowdown in production at many plants. Stellantis plants in Canada and Mexico began to operate intermittently, and component deliveries to the US declined. This was more bad news for manufacturers trying to adapt their products to a new reality where there was no longer room for cheap and efficient solutions.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
One of the most striking examples of how everything changed was the situation with the Ford Mustang Mach-E model, which was manufactured in Mexico. Against a backdrop of rising component and material prices, the company was forced to raise the price of this popular electric car by almost $2,000. This sparked a wave of discontent among consumers who began canceling orders for this model en masse. Moreover, although cars manufactured in Mexico remained popular on the market, prices for other models, such as the Maverick and Bronco Sport, also began to rise, leading to a decline in sales and a slowdown in turnover at many dealerships across the country. Against this backdrop, Ford attempted to use various marketing strategies, such as temporary price increases with special offers for buyers, but even these measures failed to stem the decline in interest. Customers became increasingly cautious in their choices, considering not only the cost of the vehicles but also the instability of supplies. A key factor influencing the market was also a change in the price structure. Consumers began to seek cheaper models, while many traditional brands began to produce more expensive versions of their cars. The increase in prices for models such as the Lincoln Nautilus, which were imported from China, was another example of how tariffs affected American manufacturers. As a result, the model ceased to compete in the market with more affordable options, and Ford was forced to discontinue its production. This move was part of a broader strategy aimed at reducing excess capacity and reallocating resources, which also led to lower sales and poorer financial performance. Things were not all rosy for other manufacturers either. Toyota, for example, was forced to significantly reduce shipments of its models to the US in order to adapt to the new conditions. This strategy had its consequences. The company lost some of its market share, but managed to remain profitable despite rising component costs. Honda and Nissan, in turn, began to reduce deliveries of certain models, such as SUVs, produced in Mexico, which also exacerbated the shortage in the market. These changes led to another worrying trend: rising car prices across the board. In April 2025, new car prices in the US rose by 2.5% in a single month, the highest price jump in several years. While consumers tried to avoid these increases by rushing to sign contracts and purchase cars before the next price hike, dealerships began to face shortages of certain models and delays in deliveries. This situation also put pressure on automakers, who, despite raising prices, were unable to fully offset the increase in costs. Ford tried to use various strategies to overcome the crisis. For example, it offered special prices for employees, which is usually done during tough economic times. But even these steps couldn't really change things. Car inventories kept growing, and production stayed limited. In response, Ford started rethinking its plans for the future. In particular, the company began to consider freezing production until the end of the year and focusing its efforts on developing new models that would be better suited to the current economic conditions. However, in the current situation, it was important not only to adapt production capacity, but also to review the structure of the industry itself. In the months following the introduction of tariffs, analysts' forecasts became increasingly pessimistic. If such economic conditions continued, the industry could face a loss of more than 1 million vehicles in sales per year, which would be a real disaster for the company and the entire US automotive industry. This was not just an economic problem, it was a threat to the future of the American automotive industry, which in its current form was no longer able to withstand modern challenges. The tariffs, which were supposed to bring manufacturing and jobs back to America, actually caused a deep crisis, and automakers began looking for ways out of the situation, facing pressure at every turn. Once tariffs on imported cars and parts took effect, the consequences for the American auto industry began to unfold at a staggering pace. Companies such as Ford and General Motors began to revise their plans, and the supply chain, which had previously been perfectly tuned and running like clockwork, began to unravel. By the time the rising tariffs became a reality, the automotive industry was already on the brink of crisis, but now this overshadowed all previous difficulties. Problems with supplies and the cost of components escalated to the limit. Manufacturers began to face shortage of essential parts, and attempts to adapt production lines encountered serious obstacles. Ford, in particular, faced a sharp increase in the price of chips and batteries, which made the production of its cars not only expensive but also unpredictable. But it was not only the internal problems faced by automakers that caused the most concern. The external threat posed by retaliatory measures, especially from China, was a source of particular tension. In response to US tariffs, China began to impose its own restrictions, leading to a sharp decline in US car exports to this key market for the industry. The decline in exports to China was a serious blow to Ford, which had previously counted on stable supplies of its models to Asia. The company was forced to revise its forecasts and abandon its ambitious plans for expansion in the Chinese market. But this blow was not the only one. In addition to China, tariffs on American cars were also introduced in other countries, such as Germany and France. This led to an even greater drop in demand for American brands, further worsening the financial situation of manufacturers. Against this backdrop of growing pressure and loss of global positions within the US, the situation did not look any better. In response to tariffs that increased the cost of cars, companies began to raise prices for their models. But this only reinforced the negative perception. Dealers and consumers began to abandon purchases, and new car sales declined globally. This particularly affected Ford's model range, including popular cars such as the Mustang Mach-E and Maverick. Even raising prices by several $1,000s did not help solve the profitability problems. Consumers became increasingly wary of expensive cars, which made the situation even more critical. Against the backdrop of all these economic difficulties, it became clear that the industry was facing more than just a short-term problem. All signs pointed to car manufacturers being forced to take much more radical steps in order to maintain their market positions. Discussions about production cuts and layoffs of thousands of workers, as well as the suspension of entire factories, became a reality. While American companies tried to find ways to offset their costs, the market remained unstable and consumer sentiment became increasingly pessimistic. But the longer this situation continued, the clearer it became that the industry could not return to normal without significant reforms. First and foremost, this concerned the very structure of the market. Many manufacturers began to rethink their business models, and Ford and GM began to intensify competition with other countries, such as China, through new tariff barriers. These measures not only failed to stabilize the situation, but also significantly worsened it, as they forced other countries to introduce retaliatory measures. But the biggest blow was that the internal problems proved unsolvable in the short term, and investors began to lose confidence in the company. In particular, Ford and GM shares began to fall amid uncertainty, leading to a sharp decline in the company's market capitalization. Against the backdrop of falling confidence in US automakers, the external market continued to shrink, and the economic crisis in the automotive industry was only gaining momentum. The process of reducing production capacity was not without additional job losses. While companies tried to revamp their production lines, raise prices, and recalculate costs, the surplus labor force began to put pressure on state economies. In indicator cities such as Detroit and Fort Wayne, economic activity declined and unemployment began to rise. Local authorities were forced to take measures to maintain employment, but in the midst of an economic crisis triggered by tariffs, it was difficult to find effective ways to support the industry. At the same time, new players entered the market, taking advantage of the instability to strengthen their positions. While American automakers continued to struggle with internal problems, Chinese and European companies actively increased their share of the US market. Chinese companies such as BYD began launching their models in the US, significantly improving their performance and offering more competitive prices. At the same time, European manufacturers such as Volkswagen began actively adapting their cars to the US market, offering more fuel-efficient models, which made them extremely attractive to buyers. The reduction in prices and improvement in the quality of these companies' products created a real crisis in the automotive market, where American brands began to lose ground in the battle for consumers. Thus, over the course of several years, the American automotive industry underwent a series of changes caused not only by internal problems, but also by external challenges. Rising tariffs, economic instability, and increased competition in the global market all led to the industry facing a real threat of losing its position in the global market. Now, the question is whether the American auto industry can adapt to the new conditions, or if it will fall victim to its own mistakes and external factors.